The Hampton estate wasn't just a house. It was a statement. Situated on 3 acres of manicured lawns, Italian stonework, and gardens that had been featured in Architectural Digest, it represented 20 years of Marcus Webb's life compressed into one perfect piece of real estate. The pool, an Olympic-sized saltwater infinity pool that seemed to spill into the horizon, had cost him $150,000 to construct. It was the crown jewel. Marcus had moved to Millbrook 8 years ago after his divorce from Jennifer. The split had been amicable by divorce standards, meaning they hadn't destroyed each other financially, though the emotional toll had been significant. He'd poured himself into work, construction development, commercial real estate, and slowly, methodically built a life that was exactly as he wanted it. No compromises, no one else's schedule to consider, no one else's dreams bleeding into his. The house was his temple of solitude. That changed 3 months before the pool incident, when the Kellerman family moved in next door. Marcus had watched the moving trucks arrive on a Friday in September. He'd been working in his home office, a converted sunroom overlooking his beloved pool, and noticed the parade of furniture, boxes, and the organized chaos that came with a family relocation. There were 3 children. He could tell from the trampoline that was assembled, the basketball hoop installed in the driveway, and the toys scattered across the lawn with the haphazard joy of kids who'd finally arrived at their new home. The mother appeared late in the afternoon, carrying boxes herself, shouting orders to her children with the practiced authority of someone used to being obeyed. Her name was Corinne Kellerman. Marcus would learn this name with the way one learns the name of a chronic ailment. Corinne was 42, though she sometimes claimed to be 39, with a kind of aggressively maintained appearance that suggested she'd fought every wrinkle with the intensity of a warrior. Blonde highlights, perpetually styled hair, designer labels visible on every garment. She had a laugh that traveled, high-pitched and frequent, that seemed to echo across the property line like an invasion of his private sanctuary. Marcus had been cordial when they met. He'd walked over with a bottle of wine and a smile, introducing himself as the neighbor. Corinne had smiled back, thanked him, and immediately begun talking about the neighborhood's vibe, the commute to the city, and her concerns about property values. "We spent everything we had on this place," she'd told him, gesturing vaguely at her newly purchased home. "Everything it better appreciate." She hadn't invited him inside. He'd returned to his side of the property line, wine-free, and tried to feel good about having attempted the neighborly gesture. The first month was manageable. The second month was when things began to shift. It started with the children. Emma, age 12, Tyler, age 9, and Sophia, age 6. They were loud, not in a way that was necessarily malicious, but in the way children are when they're happy and unsupervised. They'd play in their yard until dusk, screaming with the kind of primal joy that comes from childhood. They'd run through their property, through the community areas, and occasionally, very occasionally, Marcus would catch them looking at his pool with the hunger of children who'd only ever had a basic in-ground rectangle at their previous home. Corinne, on the other hand, had a different kind of loud. It was intentional. It was a performance. She'd host parties, loud gatherings of other women like her, women who'd read the same books, shopped at the same stores, and worried about the same social hierarchy that existed in neighborhoods like Millbrook. Marcus would hear them laughing as the sun set, the sound of wine bottles opening, the clink of glasses. He could hear them gossiping about their husbands, their exes, their therapists, their personal trainers. The walls of privacy that should have existed between properties seemed non-existent when Corinne Kellerman was the one creating the noise. But this was the suburbs. People threw parties. Marcus tried to accept it as part of the contract he'd signed when he'd chosen to live here, even though he'd specifically chosen a property with significant acreage specifically to avoid this kind of proximity. Then came the Friday in October when everything shifted. Marcus was in his pool doing his evening swim, 40 laps every night at 6 o'clock, meditative and necessary, when he noticed them. The 3 Kellerman children were standing at the edge of their property, watching him with open envy. Emma was pointing out strokes. Tyler was mimicking the crawl. Sophia was sitting in the grass, chin in her hands, her young face a portrait of longing. Marcus had done what he thought was the kind thing. He'd invited them over. "You want to swim?" he'd called out, pulling himself from the water. The children had looked at him with such immediate, desperate hope that Marcus felt something in his chest tighten. He shouldn't have. He knew he shouldn't have. But the look on their faces had overridden his instinct for self-preservation. "Come on," he'd said, gesturing them over. Ask your mom. The mom in question was summoned, and Karen Kellerman had appeared from inside her house with the speed of someone who'd been monitoring the situation the entire time. She was wearing a designer sundress and had already started changing the narrative in her head before she'd even reached the pool. "That's so sweet of you, Marcus," she'd said, her smile sharp as cut glass. "The kids have been absolutely dying to try out the pool. We're saving for one of our own, you know. This neighborhood is really just perfect for families. The amenities the community feel." She'd trailed off, but the implication was clear. You have everything. They have nothing. Doesn't it hurt to look at them wanting? The children had swum for an hour. They'd been respectful, joyful, and utterly consumed by the experience. Marcus had watched them play, had felt something crack open inside him, some part of him that had built walls against exactly this kind of connection, and he'd known with the clarity of prophecy that he'd made a mistake. By the third visit, Karen had started showing up alone while the children swam. She'd sit on one of his loungers uninvited and talk. She talked about her marriage. Her husband, Derek, worked in finance and was often away for work. She talked about her frustrations with motherhood, with the constant demands, with the way her own dreams had been subsumed into the logistics of raising 3 children. She talked about how the pool was, literally, the only bright spot in their entire month, how the children asked about it every single day. "They're so lucky to have a neighbor like you," she'd say, and Marcus would hear the subtext. "You should let them come all the time. You should understand what it means to be part of a family. You should want to help." By late October, the visits had become routine. The children would appear after school, sometimes with Karen, sometimes without. They'd swim for an hour or two, and Marcus would find himself adjusting his schedule to accommodate them. His perfect solitude had become something that included the sounds of children laughing, the smell of sunscreen, the constant low-level chaos of their presence. He told himself it was fine, they were harmless. What was the harm in a little joy? That was before he found the mother in his pool. It had been a Tuesday evening in early November, one of the first cold nights of the season. Marcus had finished work and intended to do his usual swim. He'd changed into his swim trunks and walked to the pool, sliding his feet into his flip-flops as he moved through his glass doors. The pool was glowing blue in the twilight, and in the center of that blue was Karen, doing a lazy backstroke. She wasn't in the water uninvited, exactly. The children must have mentioned the pool, and Karen must have decided that if her children were welcome, then she was welcome. That was how she worked, Marcus was learning. She had a way of taking a gesture and expanding it, reinterpreting it, until it became something entirely different from what had been originally offered. "Oh, perfect timing," she'd called out, waving at him. "I was just getting in a quick swim. The water is amazing. How do you maintain it so perfectly?" Marcus had wanted to tell her that this was his private time, that there were boundaries, that her presence was unwelcome. Instead, he'd heard himself saying, "It's a salt system, easier on the skin." She'd swum for 30 minutes while he sat on the deck, waiting for her to leave. She didn't. Eventually, he'd left, going back into his house to find her still in the water, still talking. When she'd finally emerged, she'd toweled off with one of his towels, one of the expensive ones, the ones he kept specifically for himself, and she'd smiled at him with the satisfaction of someone who'd gotten exactly what they wanted. "This is so nice," she'd said. "You know, Derek barely takes any interest in anything anymore. Having somewhere to come to just be, it means so much to me." Marcus had provided her with a robe, sent her on her way, and spent the rest of the evening standing in his pool alone, knowing that something fundamental had broken. The boundary had been breached. Karen had decided that his generosity was now her entitlement. By Thanksgiving, she was bringing her friends. By Christmas, she was suggesting he install a hot tub. By January, her children were discussing what furniture they wanted him to place poolside so they'd be more comfortable. And Marcus, who had spent years building a life of perfect control and perfect solitude, had watched his sanctuary transform into something belonging to someone else. The first real confrontation happened on a Sunday in early January. Marcus had been working in his yard, clearing leaves from around his prize-winning rose garden. Karen had appeared on her side of the property line, her face already arranged in the expression he'd come to dread, the one that suggested she'd already decided the outcome of whatever conversation was about to happen. "Marcus, we need to talk," she'd said, and those 5 words had carried the weight of an avalanche. Okay, he'd said, his stomach already tightening. The kids are asking why they can't swim in the morning before school. Tyler has swimming coming up, and it would really help his confidence if he could practice. Karen, Marcus had begun carefully, the pool is for. It's just a few hours, she'd interrupted, stepping closer, her voice taking on the injured tone of someone who'd practiced this conversation many times. What else are you using it for? It's not like you have a family. You're not here that much. Wouldn't it be nice to share? The word share had landed like a slap. Share his property, share his sanctuary, share the one thing in his life that was entirely, unquestionably his. I need to think about it, he'd said, though he'd known he wouldn't. He'd known he'd say no. And he'd known that saying no would transform him, in Karen's narrative, into something monstrous. That night he'd received a text. Not from Karen, but from Bethany Harrison, who lived 2 streets over and whom Karen had clearly enlisted. Hi, Marcus. Karen mentioned the kids wanted more pool access for swimming practice. I thought it was so sweet that you'd been letting them come. Can we set up a neighborhood swim day? It would be great for community building. By morning, there was an email from the Millbrook HOA asking about his pools, community availability during school hours. By evening, Marcus had received a handwritten note from Emma, Karen's oldest daughter, thanking him for being the best neighbor ever and saying how much the pool meant to her. The note was in Karen's handwriting, though supposedly written by Emma. That was when Marcus understood. Karen had declared war, and she decided the weapons would be guilt, social pressure, and the manipulation of her own children's emotions. He'd spent that night packing his house, staring at his pool through the glass, feeling like it was already lost. By the end of January, everything had reached a breaking point. The invitations had escalated. Karen was now hosting what she called pool parties on weekend afternoons, inviting what seemed like half the neighborhood. Marcus would arrive home from work to find people he'd never met before in his backyard, using his pool, eating snacks on his patio furniture, leaving their towels on his expensive loungers. He'd tried to stop it. He'd tried to be direct. Karen, this has to end, he'd said one Saturday afternoon when he'd found approximately 30 people in his backyard. It's just a little gathering, she'd replied, her voice sweet as poison. Everyone loves your pool. I thought you'd be happy knowing it was bringing joy to the community. This is my property. I don't want this. She'd looked at him with genuine surprise, as if he'd suggested something incomprehensible. But the children, she'd said, they depend on this. Emma told me it's the only place she feels safe. Tyler's swimming coach said the practice here is transforming him. Sophia talks about your pool in her sleep. How could you even consider taking it away from them? And there it was. The trap had been set and Marcus had walked directly into it. He'd made the mistake of caring, and Karen had weaponized his compassion against him. That night, after everyone had left and he'd cleaned his pool, Marcus had sat in his study with a glass of whiskey and had made a decision. He'd called a contractor the next morning. I want it removed, he'd said quietly into the phone. All of it, the pool, the deck, everything, I want it demolished. The contractor had thought he was joking. When Marcus had clarified that he was serious, the man had asked if he wanted to sell it, if he wanted to relocate it, if there was anything he could do to preserve it. No, Marcus had said. I want it gone. I want that concrete poured and that entire space turned into a lawn. I want it like it never existed. That's going to cost you, the contractor had warned. I know, Marcus had replied. I don't care. Because that's what Karen had done to him. She'd taken the one thing that had brought him joy, the one thing he'd built for himself, and she'd transformed it into a source of anguish. And the only way to take it back, the only way to reclaim his sanctuary, was to destroy it. The irony that he would demolish his own happiness to prevent her from stealing it wouldn't occur to him until much later. The demolition was scheduled for February 15th. Valentine's Day had passed like any other day. Marcus had spent it alone, as he had every Valentine's Day since the divorce. He'd barely noticed. The sledgehammer hit the pool deck with the force of thunder, and Karen Kellerman heard it from inside her kitchen where she was making her children's breakfasts. She stood frozen, a spatula hanging in midair, listening as the sound came again and again. The rhythmic destruction of something beautiful, something she'd come to think of as partially hers. Emma was the first to notice. She'd been sitting at the kitchen island, her backpack beside her, ready for school. Mom, she'd said, her head tilted toward the window, What's that noise? Corinne had set down the spatula and walked to the window. Through the glass, she could see the massive industrial machinery on Marcus's property. There were two men in hard hats standing with Marcus, pointing at the pool. The sledgehammer raised again, and another section of the pool deck crumbled. Corinne's face had gone very still. She hadn't said anything to the children. She'd simply finished making their breakfasts, driven them to school, and then returned home. By the time she'd circled back to her property, 1/4 of the pool had been destroyed. The blue water that had once been pristine was now draining into the ground, creating a muddy soup in what had been the shallow end. "No," she'd whispered, standing at her property line. "No, no, no." She'd called Derek at work. "He's destroying the pool," she'd said, her voice trembling with a rage that was building like a tornado. "Who's destroying what?" Derek had replied, distracted, clearly in the middle of something. "Marcus, my neighbor, he's destroying his pool." "So," Derek had said, "it's his property, he can do whatever he wants with it." "He's doing it to hurt us," Corinne had hissed. "He's doing it because he knows how much it matters to the kids." "Corinne, I really don't have time for this right now. I have a meeting in." She'd hung up on him. By midday, 3/4 of the pool had been reduced to rubble. The workers were using jackhammers now, breaking up the reinforced concrete, loading pieces into enormous trucks. Where there had been water and light and the promise of summer, there was now only dust and destruction. Corinne had tried calling Marcus. He didn't answer. She'd tried going to his front door. He didn't answer that either, though she knew he was home. She could see his car in the driveway. By the time her children came home from school, the pool was completely gone. All that remained was the concrete foundation, which was being torn up by the heavy machinery. By tomorrow, the land would be bare. Emma had cried, not dramatically, but with the quiet devastation of someone who'd lost something she'd loved. She'd stood at their kitchen window, staring at the destruction, and tears had streamed down her small face. "Why did he do that?" she'd asked her mother. "We didn't do anything wrong." "I know, baby," Corinne had said, and her voice had been poison wrapped in honey. "Some people are just cruel." Tyler had been angry. At 9 years old, he'd already learned the vocabulary of blame. "That's not fair," he'd shouted. "He let us swim there, it wasn't his to destroy." "Exactly," Corinne had said, and she'd put her hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. "Exactly right." Sophia, the youngest, had simply asked if it would grow back. When Corinne had explained that no, it wouldn't grow back, it would just be a lawn, Sophia had asked if they could plant flowers instead. It had been the only moment of hope in an otherwise perfect storm of anguish. But Corinne had quickly smoothed that hope away. "I don't think Marcus cares about flowers," she'd said. "He cares about hurting people, that's all he cares about." That evening, after the children were in bed, Corinne had sat with her laptop and begun to research. She'd looked up local laws about property damage, about neighborhood disputes, about what constituted harassment. She'd read through pages and pages of information, each article feeding her certainty that Marcus had crossed a line, not just a social line, but a legal one. Around midnight, she'd found what she was looking for. An article about a woman who'd sued her neighbor for creating a hostile environment, for deliberately harming the value of her property and the quality of her life by removing amenities that had been offered to the community. The neighbor had lost. The lawsuit had been successful. Corinne had felt her pulse quicken. It was 1 a.m., and she was already drafting an email to a lawyer. By 7 a.m., she'd had a response. The lawyer, a woman named Michelle Vasquez, had told her to come in for a consultation. Michelle specialized in neighborhood disputes and property law. She'd handled cases like this before. "It's actually not that uncommon," Michelle had told her during their initial consultation, which Corinne had scheduled for that same afternoon. "People get upset about how their property is being used, and instead of having a conversation, they just destroy things, as if that's going to somehow make the problem go away." "It's deliberate cruelty," Corinne had said, and she'd told the story in exactly the right way, painting herself as the sympathetic one, her children as innocent victims, and Marcus as a monster who destroyed something beautiful out of spite. "Do you have documentation?" Michelle had asked, pulling out a legal pad. "Texts, emails, anything that shows he had a pattern of inviting the children to use the pool and then suddenly destroying it when he decided he'd had enough." "My daughter wrote him a thank you note," Corinne had said. I have photos of the children in the pool, lots of them. Perfect, Michelle had said, and Karen had watched her begin to build the case in her head. I think we have something here. The question is, what are we asking for? Karen had hesitated. She hadn't thought that far ahead. She'd been operating on pure rage, on the instinct to punish, to hurt back. What can we ask for? She'd said. Michelle had leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. Well, there's property value depreciation. The removal of an amenity like a pool can potentially harm the perceived value of nearby properties. You could argue that you purchased your home with the understanding that your neighbor had a pool that was available for community use, and that the removal of this pool has decreased your property's value and your quality of life. Karen had felt something click into place. How much, she'd asked. Could be anywhere from $50,000 to $500,000, depending on how the court evaluates the impact, Michelle had said. The number had hung in the air between them like a promise. I'll need to do some research into comparable properties in your neighborhood, Michelle had continued. But I think we have a strong case. He offered the amenity, you relied on it, and he took it away maliciously. That's actionable. Karen had left the office feeling like she'd been handed a weapon. That night she'd called a few neighbors, the ones she trusted, the ones who gossiped freely, the ones who would spread information the way fire spreads through dry grass. She told them what Marcus had done. She'd presented it in exactly the right light, as a man so selfish, so lacking in compassion, that he'd rather destroy something beautiful than share it with children. He literally demolished his pool to keep them from using it, she'd told Bethany Harrison, making sure to sound upset. Who does that? What kind of person does that? By the next morning, half the neighborhood had their version of the story. And in the game of telephone that neighborhood gossip played, the story had transformed. By the time it had made 3 or 4 stops, Marcus had destroyed the pool out of spite, deliberately targeting Karen's children, and was apparently now planning to turn his entire property into a nightmare, a junkyard, a mud pit, something designed specifically to annoy his neighbors. Marcus didn't know any of this yet. He was at work, unaware that his reputation was being systematically dismantled, one conversation at a time. He also didn't know that Karen had already hired the lawyer, or that Michelle Vasquez was currently drawing up the initial paperwork for a lawsuit, or that his insurance company would soon be receiving a claim for property damage and emotional distress. What Marcus did know was that his pool was gone. He'd watched the demolition with grim satisfaction. Every sound of the sledgehammer had felt like he was taking something back. Every piece of concrete that had been hauled away had felt like a small victory. But as he'd watched the workers pour the foundation for the new lawn, he'd felt something else too, something hollow and regretful that he couldn't quite name. He'd destroyed something beautiful. He'd cut off his own arm to prove a point. And he had no idea that Karen was already planning to make him pay for it. The lawsuit was filed on February 20th. Marcus received a formal notice in the mail, registered and everything, informing him that Karen Kellerman was taking legal action against him for property damage, emotional distress, and the creation of a hostile neighborhood environment. The amount she was suing for was $300,000. Marcus had read the papers 3 times before he'd truly comprehended what he was seeing. $300,000 for removing his own pool. He'd called his lawyer, a man named Robert Chen who handled his business affairs, and read the suit to him over the phone. Is this serious? Marcus had asked, even though he knew from Robert's silence that it was. It's serious, Robert had confirmed. She's claiming that you deliberately destroyed an amenity that was offered to the community, that your actions have caused emotional distress to her and her children, and that it's reduced the value of her property. But it's my property, Marcus had said, hearing the desperation in his own voice. I can do whatever I want with it. Generally, yes, Robert had said. But here's the complication. If you offered the amenity with the understanding that it would continue to be available, and then removed it maliciously, some courts have found that to be a form of property harassment or emotional distress. I didn't offer it permanently, Marcus had protested. I let the kids swim a few times. How many times? Robert had asked. Marcus had had to think about it. Over the 3 months he'd allowed them to use the pool, it had probably been at least once or twice a week, sometimes more. Often enough that they came to rely on it, Robert had said quietly. and often enough that her lawyer is going to argue that you created a reasonable expectation of continued access. "So what do I do?" Marcus had asked. "We fight it," Robert had said. "But I'm not going to lie to you. This is going to be expensive, and the outcome is uncertain. We need to gather documentation. We need to establish that you had a right to remove the pool whenever you wanted. And we need to prove that any emotional distress was not directly caused by your actions, but rather by her interpretation of your actions." Marcus had hung up the phone feeling like the ground was shifting beneath him. He tried to take control of his own life, and in doing so, he'd handed Karen exactly what she needed. There were those who sided with Karen, the families with children, the people who believed in community sharing, the ones who thought Marcus was a selfish curmudgeon who deserved what was coming to him. This camp was led primarily by Bethany Harrison and a few other women who'd successfully insinuated themselves into Karen's inner circle. They called themselves community advocates, though what they were really doing was spreading carefully curated versions of the truth that made Marcus look like a villain. Then there were those who sided with Marcus, primarily the older residents, the people who valued property rights and personal autonomy, and the ones who'd had their own run-ins with Karen's aggressive social politics. This camp included Thomas Alerting, who lived 3 properties over and who'd refused to join one of Karen's community initiatives years ago and had been socially ostracized for it. And then there were the fence-sitters, the people who thought Marcus had been unkind but also acknowledged that it was his pool and he could do what he wanted with it. These people were the most interesting because they were the ones Karen was targeting. She did it through careful manipulation. She started a group chat with several of the fence-sitting families. She called it Millbrook Community Harmony, and she used it to post daily updates about the lawsuit, each one framed in a way that made Marcus look worse and worse. Karen, in group chat, "Just got back from another meeting with my lawyer. She says what he did is actually pretty common among people dealing with social isolation. Apparently, deliberately destroying community resources as a way to punish people is a recognized form of psychological displacement." No lawyer had said any such thing, but the message had been delivered and absorbed by the people reading it. Karen, in group chat, "Emma hasn't been sleeping well since the pool was destroyed. Our pediatrician thinks she might be developing anxiety. It's so hard knowing that one neighbor's cruelty is affecting my child's mental health." Marcus hadn't been cruel. He'd simply removed his pool. But in Karen's narrative, the removal itself was the cruelty. Karen, in group chat, "The realtor said our property value has dropped by approximately $40,000 since the pool was demolished. We'll probably never recover that loss. Our entire life savings are tied up in this house, and he's actively destroying its value. I don't even know how we're supposed to cope with that financially." The property value hadn't dropped. If anything, it might have slightly increased as the market had shifted. But the claim had been planted, and it had taken root. Within 3 weeks, the group chat had grown to include almost 20 families. And within those 3 weeks, the narrative had solidified. Marcus Webb was a selfish, cruel man who destroyed something beautiful out of spite, and he was actively harming the entire community. People began to distance themselves from him. At the neighborhood coffee shop, conversations would stop when he walked in. The HOA president, a man named Gerald Thompson, suddenly began taking Karen's complaints seriously. Complaints about everything from the mulch color in Marcus's landscaping to the architectural style of his back gate. "We need to maintain community standards," Gerald had said during one HOA meeting, his eyes pointedly not meeting Marcus's as he presented a list of alleged violations of the neighborhood guidelines. "Some residents have expressed concerns about their properties being negatively impacted by deliberate neglect." "My property is not neglected," Marcus had replied, his voice controlled but furious. "And you know that. We'll need visual documentation before we can make a final determination," Gerald had said, suddenly very official, suddenly very neutral. What had been Marcus's sanctuary was becoming his prison. Then came the incident at the grocery store. Marcus had been picking up supplies for dinner, some salmon, vegetables, a decent bottle of wine, when he'd run into Karen at the checkout. She was buying groceries for what looked like one of her parties. Her cart was overflowing with expensive items, imported cheeses, fresh flowers for the centerpiece. "Oh, Marcus," she'd said, her smile sharp as a knife. "Hi." He'd nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "I wanted to thank you, actually," she'd continued, moving her cart closer to him. For really bringing the neighborhood together. There's something about a common enemy that just creates such strong community bonds, you know? Before the lawsuit, people didn't really interact much. Now everyone's connected by their concern for my family's well-being. It's actually quite beautiful in a weird way. Marcus had stared at her, truly understanding for the first time that she had engineered this entire situation. She had weaponized her children's disappointment, weaponized the neighborhood's social structure, weaponized the legal system, and she'd done it all with the smile of someone who'd orchestrated a perfect performance. "You're sick," he'd said quietly. "I'm a mother protecting her children," she'd replied. "There's nothing sick about that." She'd paid for her groceries and walked out, leaving Marcus standing in the checkout line feeling like he'd been punched. That conversation, edited and refined, had made its way through the neighborhood within hours. According to Corinne's version, Marcus had called her sick, had insulted her family, and had made her feel threatened. She'd told the story with just enough dramatic tremor in her voice to make people believe she was genuinely scared of him. The next day, Marcus received a certified letter from his HOA. They were formally requesting that he submit to a property inspection within the next 2 weeks to ensure his house was in compliance with neighborhood guidelines. If he failed the inspection, he would face fines. His house was immaculate. He knew he would pass the inspection. But the point wasn't the inspection. The point was to harass him, to make him feel unsafe and targeted in his own community. Robert, his lawyer, advised him to document everything. "Take photos of your property," Robert had said. "Write down every interaction with her, every message, every person who's treated you differently since the lawsuit was filed. We need to establish a pattern of harassment." "But it's not harassment," Marcus had said. "It's just social ostracism. It's not illegal." "No, but if we can prove that she's deliberately orchestrated a campaign to harm your reputation and damage your quality of life, that could be used to demonstrate that she's the unreasonable party in this dispute. It might help us in court." So Marcus had become a documenter of his own isolation. He'd photographed every inch of his property, noting angles and lighting and the meticulous care he'd taken. He'd saved every HOA notice, every email, every interaction. He'd kept a journal of neighborhoods who'd stopped waving at him, of grocery store clerks who'd seemed to recognize him with pity rather than friendliness, of the way the sense of community he'd never particularly wanted had transformed into a community united against him. Meanwhile, Corinne had become something of a celebrity in the neighborhood. She was the wronged woman, the protective mother, the brave widow fighting against an unjust neighbor. The fact that Derek was very much alive and simply uninvolved in this drama had been conveniently omitted from the narrative. She'd been invited to give a presentation at the HOA meeting about creating safe community spaces. She'd been quoted in the neighborhood newsletter about property values and community resources. She'd positioned herself as an advocate, a voice for the voiceless, a person fighting against selfish individualism in favor of community cooperation. It was a masterclass in public manipulation. And Marcus, sitting alone in his house watching this performance from the sidelines, had begun to understand that he'd lost. Not the lawsuit that hadn't even gone to trial yet, but something more fundamental. He'd lost the moral high ground. He'd lost the story. He'd lost his place in the community. Because in the end, Corinne had been right about one thing. He had destroyed something beautiful out of spite. He'd cut off his own arm to prevent her from touching it. And in doing so, he'd proved her point, that he was selfish, that he was cruel, that he was the kind of person who would hurt himself just to hurt someone else. The realization hit him on a Tuesday evening around dusk when he was standing in his backyard looking at the empty space where the pool had been. The contractor had finished the new lawn. Fresh grass was growing in. In a few months, it would be impossible to tell there'd ever been anything there. Except for the scar it had left. He'd received the formal discovery documents from Corinne's lawyer that morning. They were suing him not just for the pool, but for emotional distress, property damage, and for what they called deliberate creation of a hostile neighborhood environment. The lawsuit had now expanded to include testimony from Emma's school counselor, who said Emma had been dealing with environmental trauma, from a property appraiser, who claimed the neighborhood was now less desirable due to Marcus's reckless demolition, and from multiple neighbors, who'd submitted statements about how unsafe and uncomfortable they felt knowing that someone in their community was willing to destroy things maliciously. Karen had also hired a psychologist who'd written an expert report claiming that Marcus's actions were consistent with narcissistic personality disorder combined with retaliatory aggression. Robert had sent him a note with all of this attached. "This is going to be an ugly fight. She's building a narrative where you're not just wrong, you're unstable. They're going to present you as a danger to the community. We need to respond to every claim, and we need to be ready to prove that you're not the villain in this story." But Marcus was beginning to think that the story was all that mattered now. The truth, that it was his property and he'd had every right to do what he wanted with it, was being buried under the weight of Karen's narrative, under the emotions of her children, under the social structure of the community that had decided to believe her version of events. As the sun set that evening, Marcus stood in his empty backyard and made a decision. He was going to fight, not because he thought he'd win, but because he couldn't afford to lose. If he lost this lawsuit, every person in the neighborhood would see him as someone who'd been judged and found wanting. He would be permanently branded as the villain in Karen's story. He didn't yet understand that fighting back would only give Karen more ammunition. He didn't understand that every action he took in response to her would be twisted and reframed as further evidence of his malicious nature. He was about to walk directly into a trap that had been set for him weeks ago, and there was no way out. The trial was scheduled for June 15th, exactly 4 months after Marcus had demolished the pool. In that 4 months, the neighborhood narrative had hardened into something unmovable. Marcus had become the bad guy. He was no longer the successful businessman who'd built a beautiful home. He was the cruel neighbor who destroyed community resources. The Houston Chronicle had even picked up the story, a human interest piece titled "One Woman's Fight for Community Justice in Texas Suburbs." The journalist had interviewed Karen, had photographed her children, and had presented her as a David-like figure fighting against a Goliath of masculine selfishness. The article had made no mention of Marcus. That was perhaps the cruelest part. He'd been completely erased from the narrative. By mid-June, Marcus had stopped going to the neighborhood coffee shop. He'd stopped greeting neighbors. He'd stopped pretending that his life hadn't become fundamentally fractured. He'd invested in a high-end security system for his property. He'd hired a second lawyer, a trial specialist named Dorothy Hughes, who had a reputation for being aggressive, brilliant, and utterly ruthless in court. "Here's what we're going to do," Dorothy had told him during their first meeting. "We're going to make her story fall apart. We're going to show the court that she manufactured this crisis, that she exploited your kindness, and that she's now using the legal system as a weapon against you." "Can we do that?" Marcus had asked. "We can try," Dorothy had said. "And if we're successful, the court isn't going to just dismiss her lawsuit. They're going to understand that she's a manipulative person and she's using her children as emotional weapons. That's not going to look good for her." What Dorothy was offering was the possibility of not just winning the case, but destroying Karen in the process. And on some level, in some dark corner of his soul, Marcus had wanted exactly that. The trial was held in the Millbrook Courthouse, a modern building with impressive architecture and a distinct lack of soul. The courtroom was packed. It seemed like half the neighborhood had showed up. Karen had brought her children, all 3 of them, dressed in their best clothes, looking suitably distressed. Derek had finally shown up for something, though he looked deeply uncomfortable, like he'd been forced to attend against his will. Marcus sat with Dorothy and Robert, looking at the faces in the gallery, and realizing that he was about to be publicly judged by people he'd lived next to for 8 years. Karen's lawyer, Michelle Vasquez, presented first. She built the case with the precision of someone who'd done this many times before. She presented photos of the children in the pool, looking joyful. She presented Emma's handwritten thank you note. She presented testimony from the neighbors about how important the pool had been for the community, about how children with limited resources had been able to experience something they otherwise couldn't afford. The defendant invited the community to use his pool, Michelle had said, gesturing toward Marcus with theatrical certainty. He offered it freely and often, and then when he decided he'd had enough of being a good neighbor, he destroyed it, not out of practical necessity, but out of pure spite, out of a desire to punish my client and her family. She presented testimony from the school counselor about Emma's anxiety. She presented testimony from a property appraiser who claimed that the removal of the pool had reduced neighborhood desirability. She presented testimony from neighbors who'd said they felt unsafe, knowing that Marcus was capable of such destructive behavior. When it was Dorothy's turn, she began by reading part of the HOA agreement that every resident had signed upon purchase of their property. Specifically, the clause that stated, "Residents have the right to use their property as they see fit, provided it complies with all applicable laws and regulations. The use of private property for personal purposes is not subject to community approval." "My client," Dorothy said, walking around the courtroom with measured steps, "had every legal right to remove his pool. The fact that he had allowed the neighbor's children to use it as a courtesy is not the same as offering it permanently. It's not the same as creating a legal obligation, and it's certainly not the same as justifying a lawsuit." Then Dorothy had called Marcus to the stand. He'd walked up with his heart pounding, feeling like he was entering the lion's den. Dorothy had taken him through his testimony with the precision of someone conducting a surgery. She'd asked him about his history with the neighborhood, about his reasons for allowing the children to use the pool, about the gradual escalation of Corinne's behavior. "When did you first realize that the situation had become untenable?" Dorothy had asked. "When she was in my pool alone," Marcus had said. "When I realized she decided my home was her property." "And at what point did you decide to remove the pool?" "When I understood that I'd lost control of my own sanctuary," Marcus had said. "When I realized that whatever boundaries I tried to set were being ignored or reinterpreted, the pool had become a source of conflict rather than joy." "So you removed it to reclaim your property?" "Yes," Marcus had said. "I removed it to reclaim my life." It had been a good answer. It had been honest and reasonable and made perfect sense from a legal standpoint. Then Michelle had cross-examined him. "Mr. Webb," she'd said, her voice soft and sympathetic, "I want to understand your emotional state when you made the decision to demolish the pool. Can you describe that for us?" Marcus had hesitated. This was the trap. Dorothy had warned him about this. "I was frustrated," he'd said carefully. "Frustrated enough to destroy a $150,000 amenity," Michelle had pressed. "That seems like more than frustration. That seems like rage." "It was practical," Marcus had said. "A $150,000 practical decision," Michelle had raised her eyebrow. "Or an emotional decision, a decision made by someone who was angry and wanted to hurt the people who'd upset him." "I wanted my life back," Marcus had said, and he'd heard the anger in his own voice. "By destroying the one thing that brought joy to children who had done nothing to hurt you." "That's not," Marcus had started. "And you didn't consider," Michelle had interrupted, "that there might be better ways to handle this situation, that you could have simply told the children they could no longer use the pool, that you could have installed a fence, posted signs, done literally anything other than deliberately demolishing an entire structure." "I made a decision," Marcus had said. "I regret," he'd stopped himself. He couldn't say he regretted it. If he said he regretted it, he admitted wrongdoing. "You regret what?" Michelle had pressed. "I regret that this situation escalated the way it did," Marcus had said carefully. But the damage was done. Michelle had planted the seed of doubt, the suggestion that Marcus wasn't just acting reasonably, but that he was a man motivated by anger and spite. The jury had watched him struggle to explain himself, and in that struggle, they'd seen exactly what Corinne wanted them to see: a selfish man defending a selfish decision. Then Corinne had taken the stand. She told her story with the polish of someone who'd practiced it 1,000 times. She talked about how the pool had changed her children's lives, how it had given them confidence and joy, how the destruction of it had been like a betrayal. Emma had just started to believe in herself, Corinne had said, and tears had begun to stream down her face. She was becoming confident in the water, and then suddenly it was gone, and not for any practical reason, just because Marcus was angry with us. "Were you aware," Dorothy had asked during cross-examination, "that Mr. Webb had the legal right to remove the pool whenever he wanted?" "I assumed," Corinne had said carefully, "that if he was offering it to the children, he was doing so with the understanding that it would continue to be available." "But he never said that." "No, but—" "So you made an assumption about his intentions, and when he acted differently than you assumed, you filed a lawsuit." "It was about more than the pool," Corinne had said. "It was about the principle he was cruel to my children." "How was he cruel?" "By taking away something he'd given to them." And there it was, the fundamental disagreement. Corinne believed that by offering something once, Marcus had created an obligation to continue offering it forever. Dorothy was arguing that he had no such obligation. These two perspectives were irreconcilable. The jury seemed torn. Some of them looked sympathetic to Marcus. Others looked like they wanted to side with Corinne. Then Dorothy presented what she thought would be her trump card, testimony from Marcus's ex-wife Jennifer. "Ms. Webb," Dorothy had asked, "can you describe Mr. Webb's character? Is he a selfish person, or is he someone who values his own boundaries?" Jennifer had been careful and measured in her response, choosing her words with the precision of someone who still cared about her ex-husband, even though the marriage hadn't worked. "Marcus values his privacy and his autonomy," Jennifer had said. "After our divorce, he was very deliberate about building a life that was exactly as he wanted it. He wasn't being selfish, he was being intentional. There's a difference." "And would you describe him as someone prone to rage or spite?" "No," Jennifer had said. "I'd describe him as someone who doesn't express his emotions easily. He holds things in. When he makes a decision, it's usually after a lot of thought, even if it looks sudden to other people." But then Michelle had cross-examined her. "Ms. Webb, you said that your ex-husband values autonomy and builds his life exactly as he wants it. Doesn't that sound like someone who might struggle with compromise, someone who might struggle with sharing?" "Someone who, when confronted with neighbors who wanted to use his pool, might become resentful and ultimately destructive." "That's not fair," Jennifer had said. "Marcus is generous. He was generous with me, and I assume he was generous with his neighbor." "Until he wasn't," Michelle had asked. And suddenly, Marcus's ex-wife, who'd been trying to help him, had been reframed as a witness to his essential selfishness. The closing arguments had been devastating. Michelle had painted a picture of Marcus as a man so consumed with his own desires for privacy and control that he was willing to hurt innocent children. She'd positioned him as a man incapable of human connection, incapable of sharing, incapable of being part of a community. She'd made him sound like a sociopath. Dorothy had countered by presenting him as a man defending his legal rights, his property, his autonomy. She'd argued that he had no obligation to share his possessions with anyone, and that the moment he'd tried to set boundaries, Corinne had weaponized the legal system against him. But Dorothy's argument, while legally sound, was emotionally hollow. The jury didn't care about property rights. They cared about a mother protecting her children. They cared about the narrative. The jury had returned with their verdict after 6 hours of deliberation. Guilty, well, not guilty. Juries didn't return guilty verdicts in civil cases, but they had found in favor of Corinne. They had decided that Marcus had created an emotional distress through the deliberate removal of the pool, and they were awarding Corinne $150,000 in damages. Not the full $300,000 she'd asked for, but more than enough to devastate him. Marcus had heard the verdict and had felt something break inside him. He'd looked at Corinne in the gallery and seen her face transformed by the victory. She was smiling, not triumphantly, but sadly, as if she'd won something she'd never wanted to win. That had been worse than her rage. Because Marcus understood in that moment that she'd won something far more valuable than money. She'd won the power to rewrite his story. She'd won the right to be the victim. She'd won the ability to walk through her neighborhood with the confidence of someone who'd been publicly validated. And Marcus had been branded as the villain. He didn't want to. There was no rational reason to leave a home he'd spent 8 years perfecting. But he couldn't stay. Every time he stepped outside, he felt the weight of the neighborhood's judgment. Every time he went to the mailbox, he expected to find another lawsuit, another piece of legal paperwork, another attack. He couldn't live like that. The realtor had warned him that the sale price wouldn't be what he'd hoped for. "People know about the lawsuit," she'd said gently. "Neighborhoods remember these things. There's a story attached to this property now." She was right. The house that should have sold for $3 million sold for $2.2. The buyer was someone new to the area who hadn't yet learned the history of the place. Marcus had considered warning him, considered telling him about Corinne and the pool and the lawsuit. He'd decided against it. It wouldn't change anything, and it would only make him sound bitter. On the day Marcus moved out, he didn't say goodbye to anyone. He'd hired a moving company, and they'd loaded his possessions into a truck. He'd driven away from Millbrook at dawn, when the neighborhood was still mostly asleep. He hadn't looked back. He'd rented a small apartment in downtown Houston, nothing like his former estate. It was urban and anonymous felt like mercy. No neighbors, no community, no one knew his story here. But the story followed him anyway. The article had been published in the Houston Chronicle 2 weeks after the trial verdict. Local woman wins battle against selfish neighbor, it had been titled, and the journalist had followed up on the original story with a triumphant conclusion. There had been a photo of Karen and her children looking hopeful and victorious. There had been no photo of Marcus. There had been no quote from him. He'd been completely erased from the narrative, replaced by a paragraph explaining that he'd declined to comment. Marcus had read the article at 3 in the morning, sitting in his apartment, feeling like a ghost. His professional reputation, it turned out, had also taken a hit. A few of his business partners had mentioned, delicately, that they'd been concerned about the lawsuit situation. One of his largest clients had quietly decided to go with a different development company, someone less controversial. The narrative had followed him into his professional life, tainting it with the same brush that had painted him as a villain in his personal life. He'd ended up liquidating several business ventures just to maintain cash flow and reduce his public profile. He'd paid Karen the $150,000 through his lawyer, transferring it via check to her account. Robert had sent him a short email when it was done. It's over. Except it wasn't over, it would never be over. Because the internet has a very long memory. The article about the lawsuit had been shared on several neighborhood social media groups, and from there it had spread to Reddit, to various legal interest pages, to anywhere people gathered to discuss interpersonal drama. The story had been simplified down to its essential narrative. Selfish man destroys his pool to keep children out, loses court case, and has to pay. There were people who were sympathetic to Marcus. They'd argue in the comments that it was his property and he should be allowed to do what he wanted with it. These people would be immediately attacked by others who'd framed the situation differently. He let children use his pool as a kind gesture, then destroyed it out of spite. Each version of the story was true, depending on what you chose to believe. Marcus, watching this play out from his apartment, had begun to understand something troubling, that the truth didn't matter. What mattered was the narrative that prevailed. And the narrative that had prevailed was that he was a cruel, selfish man who deliberately hurt children. He'd tried to rebuild his life. He'd thrown himself into his work, taking on new projects, focusing on the parts of his life that were still controllable. He'd gone to therapy, something he'd resisted for years, and he'd talked to his therapist, Dr. Elena Vasquez, about the sense of violation he felt. "What's interesting," Dr. Vasquez had said during one session, "is that you destroyed the pool to reclaim your autonomy, but in doing so, you ceded control of your narrative to someone else. Karen got to tell the story of what happened, and you didn't get to tell yours." "What's my story?" Marcus had asked bitterly. "That I'm an asshole who destroyed his own property out of spite." "Is that your story?" Dr. Vasquez had asked. "Or is it the story that's been told about you?" Marcus hadn't had an answer. 3 months after moving to the apartment, he'd received a cease and desist letter from Karen's lawyer. Someone on social media had claimed that Marcus was posting about the situation under a fake name. He wasn't. He'd never even created a fake social media account, but Karen was claiming harassment anyway. Robert had handled it, sending a response explaining that Marcus had no involvement in any social media activity. But the message was clear. Karen was still thinking about him, still monitoring him, still trying to keep him off balance. "Why is she still after me?" Marcus had asked Robert. "She won, she got her money, it's over." "It's never over for people like her," Robert had said wearily. "Winning just means they've confirmed their narrative. Now they have to keep defending it, keep proving that they were right about you." "That's insane." "Yes," Robert had agreed, "but it's also human nature." What Marcus didn't know, what he wouldn't find out until much later, was that Karen's victory had actually created problems for her. The neighborhood, it turned out, had eventually tired of her story. Winning a lawsuit had made her seem less like a victim and more like a litigant. Some of the neighbors who'd initially supported her had begun to reconsider their positions. Derek, her husband, had begun making comments about how the money Marcus had paid wasn't worth the emotional cost of the litigation. Emma had started having anxiety attacks. Tyler had become withdrawn. Sophia had asked repeatedly if they were going to keep suing people. The victory had been hollow, but Karen didn't know how to let it go. She'd invested so much emotional energy into positioning herself as the victim that she couldn't accept the reality that she was now, in many ways, the villain. The person who'd pursued someone through the court system, who'd weaponized her children's emotions, who destroyed a man's reputation for a paycheck. That realization, when it finally came to her, came with the weight of 1,000 bricks. She'd see Marcus's name in business publications. He'd eventually recovered his professional reputation, though his work was now very different, more corporate, less personal. She'd read about his new projects, and she'd wonder if he was happy. She'd wonder if she'd damaged him permanently or if he'd managed to move on. Occasionally, in her neighborhood social media groups, she'd see people defending Marcus. They'd share the original articles, argue about property rights, suggest that Karen had overreacted, and each defense of him had felt like a betrayal. She'd won the lawsuit, but she'd lost the narrative war. By the time a year had passed, both Marcus and Karen had come to understand that victory and defeat were illusions. They'd both been damaged by the situation, just in different ways. Marcus had lost his home, his privacy, his peace of mind. Karen had won a lawsuit but lost something more valuable, the ability to feel like the moral center of her own story. 4 years later, Karen would see Marcus at a grocery store in a different neighborhood. They'd made eye contact across the produce section, and for a moment, there had been actual recognition, not of each other as people, but of what they'd done to each other. She'd looked away first. Marcus had also looked away, and they'd continued shopping, passing each other like ghosts from a past life. Neither of them had spoken. Neither of them had acknowledged the other, and in that silence there had been a kind of resolution, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but a mutual understanding that the battle had been for nothing, that the victory had been Pyrrhic, that sometimes the only way to lose is to win. It happened on a Thursday evening in early October, 5 years after the lawsuit had ended. Marcus was in his office, a downtown Houston high-rise, very different from the home office he'd once had overlooking the pool, when he received an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "I'm sorry." He almost deleted it, assuming it was spam or another piece of internet flotsam, but something made him pause and read the message. "Marcus, it's Karen. I'm not sure why I'm writing this, except that I saw an article about a development you're working on in the suburbs, and I realized I'd never actually apologized for what I did. I've had 5 years to think about what happened, and I understand now that I destroyed your life in order to protect my ego. I told myself I was protecting my children, but the truth is I was protecting myself. When you removed the pool, I felt rejected, and instead of dealing with that rejection like an adult, I sued you. My marriage fell apart last year. Derek left because he said he was tired of living in a house haunted by litigation and resentment. Emma is in therapy dealing with the guilt of having been used as a weapon in my battle against you. Tyler hasn't spoken to me in 6 months. Sophia is the only one who still talks to me, and I can see the exhaustion in her face. She's tired of being my emotional support system. I won the lawsuit, and I lost everything. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect this email to change anything. But I thought you deserved to know that karma isn't a philosophical concept. It's just the slowly accumulating weight of our own choices coming back to crush us. I destroyed your sanctuary, and in doing so, I destroyed my own. I'm sorry. Karen." Marcus had read the email 3 times. He'd felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, no sense that justice had been served. He'd simply felt tired. He'd written back, "Karen, I believe you, and I forgive you. Not because what you did was okay, but because holding on to anger has already cost me enough. It cost me my home, my peace, and 5 years of my life. I won't let it cost me anything else. I hope you find peace. I hope your children find it too. And I hope you can forgive yourself because carrying that weight is only going to destroy you more. Marcus." He'd hit send and then had closed his laptop, walked to the window of his office, and looked out at the city sprawling beneath him. He'd thought about the pool. He'd thought about the moment he'd called the contractor. He'd thought about the choice he'd made to destroy something beautiful to prevent someone else from having it. And he'd finally understood what that choice had really been, not a defense of his property, but a surrender of his life. He'd handed over his autonomy the moment he decided that Karen's happiness mattered more than his own peace. He'd given her power over him by making her the reason for his actions. It had taken 5 years, and Corinne's own collapse for him to see that clearly. The pool had just been water and concrete, but the real damage had been somewhere else, in the stories he'd told himself about who he was, in the way he'd allowed her narrative to overwrite his own, in the way he'd believed that hurting someone else could somehow heal himself. It couldn't, nothing could. Marcus had spent the next year actively working to rebuild the parts of his life that had been damaged. He'd reconnected with his ex-wife Jennifer. They'd never gotten back together, but they'd become actual friends, not just people bound together by a legal document. He'd started volunteering, working with nonprofit organizations that helped underprivileged families get access to recreational resources. He'd become the antithesis of what Corinne had accused him of being. He'd also slowly worked his way back to Millbrook. Not to live there, that chapter of his life was closed. But professionally, he'd taken on a development project in the community, a public pool and community center that would serve the neighborhood's younger residents. When the project was approved by the HOA, there'd been one dissenting vote, Gerald Thompson, the current HOA president. But everyone else had voted in favor. Marcus had stood in the groundbreaking ceremony, holding a shovel, looking at the empty land where something new would be built. And he'd thought about the pool he'd destroyed, about the children who'd wanted to swim in it, about the ways we hurt ourselves trying to control the things we can't control. The project had taken 1.5 years to complete. When it finally opened, Marcus had been invited to the ribbon-cutting ceremony. He'd almost declined, but something had pushed him to go. When he'd arrived, he'd seen families, lots of them, many from the neighborhood, bringing their children to the pool for the first time. He'd seen the joy on their faces, the same joy he'd once denied them in his own backyard. And he'd seen Corinne. She'd been there with Sophia, who was now a teenager. The girl had recognized Marcus and had smiled, not knowing who he was or what history existed between her mother and this man cutting the ribbon. Corinne had seen the recognition and had looked away, but not before Marcus had seen something in her face. Regret, yes, but also acceptance. A kind of peace that comes from finally understanding the consequences of your own choices. After the ceremony, Marcus had walked over to them. "Hi, Corinne," he'd said. "Marcus," she'd replied, her voice steady but quiet. "Thank you for building this. The neighborhood needed it." "How are your kids?" he'd asked. "Better," she'd said. "Emma's in college now. She's studying psychology. She wants to help people work through relationship trauma. I think she got that from us, from everything that happened." "That's good," Marcus had said. "That's really good." "Tyler reached out last month," Corinne had continued. "He said he forgave me. I'm trying to earn that forgiveness every day." "I'm glad," Marcus had said, and he'd meant it. They'd stood there for a moment, two people who'd damaged each other, who'd spent years in a legal and emotional battle, who'd finally arrived at a place where they could acknowledge each other's humanity without needing to punish each other for it. "I think about the pool sometimes," Corinne had said, "about how different things could have been if I'd just accepted the boundaries you were trying to set. I think about how different things could have been if I'd just had a conversation instead of destroying everything," Marcus had replied. "Do you regret it?" Corinne had asked. Marcus had considered the question carefully. Did he regret removing the pool? Yes. Did he regret what had led to the removal? Yes. Did he regret the lawsuit, the destruction of his neighborhood reputation, the forced move, the years of rebuilding? All of it had been terrible. All of it had been unnecessary. All of it could have been prevented by two people simply being honest about their boundaries and then respecting them. But did he regret the person he'd become because of it? That was a different question. "I regret a lot of things," Marcus had finally said, "but I'm grateful for who I've become because of them. Does that make sense?" Corinne had nodded. "That's what Emma told me too," she'd said. "She said that growth doesn't come from having everything go right. It comes from surviving the things that go very wrong and figuring out how to be better." Marcus had smiled. A real smile, not a defensive one or an angry one, but genuine. "Your daughter sounds wise," he'd said. "She got that from you," Corinne had replied. And there was no malice in the statement, just an acknowledgement of the strange way that enemies can sometimes teach us the most important lessons. The conversation had ended there. Marcus and Corinne had parted ways, moving through the crowd toward their respective lives. He'd never seen her again, though he'd occasionally heard updates through the grapevine. Derek had remarried, Emma had graduated, Tyler was involved with local youth development. Sophia had become an artist. The neighborhood had moved on. The lawsuit had become a historical footnote, a story that older residents told newer ones as a kind of warning about the dangers of escalating minor conflicts into major ones. Marcus had moved on too. He'd eventually bought a new house, not as grand as the Hamptons estate, but beautiful in its own way. It didn't have a pool. He decided that some things weren't meant to be part of his life, and that was okay. What he'd learned from everything was that we're all just trying to protect something. Our autonomy, our children, our ego, our sense that we're good people. And sometimes in protecting those things, we destroy everything around us and end up protecting nothing at all. The pool had just been water and concrete, but the lessons it had taught him had been worth far more than the money he'd paid, worth more than the years he'd lost, worth more than the reputation he'd had to rebuild. He'd learned that community isn't something you can refuse and expect to be unscathed. He'd learned that boundaries matter, but so does compassion. He'd learned that victory isn't worth the price you pay for it if that price is your own peace. And he'd learned that the monsters we see in others are often just reflections of the parts of ourselves we're afraid to face. Years later, when people asked Marcus about the pool incident, he'd tell them the truth. It had been complicated. Karen had been wrong to sue him. He'd been wrong to destroy his own property out of spite. They'd both been operating from places of fear and hurt, and they'd both done damage to themselves and each other as a result. But he'd also say that it had changed him for the better. That sometimes the worst things that happen to us contain the seeds of the best things we can become. And that was the real reckoning, not the lawsuit, not the judgment, not the money. It was understanding that every action has consequences, and that those consequences ripple outward in ways we can never fully anticipate. The pool was gone, but the community center that replaced it would serve thousands of children over the next decade. And that, Marcus had come to understand, was the only redemption that truly mattered.